Hello and welcome to the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, helping everyday runners fuel better, run smarter, and recover faster so you can reach your full performance potential. I'm your host, Stephanie Natchek, dietitian, fitness coach, and a fellow runner too. As the owner of Stephanie Natchek Performance Nutrition, I've spent the last 10 years helping runners learn to fuel their bodies, level up their running performance, and establish healthier relationships with food and exercise. If you're ready to reconnect with your love of running, then let's get started on today's episode. All right. So hello and welcome everyone to today's episode of the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast. I am really excited to be sitting down with Alan McCubbin, who is joining us from Australia, which is far away for me, but may not be so far away for you, depending on where you happen to be listening from. And we are here today to talk all about hydration for runners. And I just want to share a little bit of background about how this conversation kind of came to be. I had watched a webinar that Alan had done a presentation for an online sports science group that I'm a member of. And I thought he had some really interesting, really unique insights to share all about hydration, fluids, electrolytes, everything to do with what we need to focus on as endurance athletes, but we need to maybe not focus on as much as endurance athletes. And I thought, rather than me trying to do, this conversation justice on my own, let's bring in the expert and let's hear everything that he has to say, everything he has to share, all about hydration for runners. So thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show and share your expertise and for booking this conversation with me today.
Yeah, not a problem at all. It's always great. I think whenever you sort of spend a huge amount of time thinking about and working in an area, it's always fun to talk about it. So yeah, pleasure.
Yes, sounds great. So that is perfect kind of segue into the first thing that I wanted to hear more about from you. Tell us a little bit more about yourself, your education, your work, and what you do now to help endurance athletes.
Yeah. So I'm a sports dietitian based here in Australia. So obviously, in most of the world, you have registered dietitians, and depending on where you are in the world, there's different qualifications for sports dietitians specifically. So in the States, for example, you have your certified specialist sports dietitians, I think it is, CSSD. In Australia, we have a it's a very different system. We have accredited practicing dietitians and then accredited sports dietitians. So I've done both of those. So I guess in terms of my background around hydration and electrolytes specifically, I was actually a practitioner for 10 odd years before I even stepped into the university sector and worked in the research setting. So worked with a range of athletes over that time, but became more and more involved in endurance and ultra endurance sports just because of the sort of clientele I was getting and sort of contacts I had and that sort of thing, and just became progressively more involved in that, primarily in cycling and triathlon, but then more into ultra running as well. And then opportunity came up to leave where I was working at the time, return to the university sector, do a PhD there, and teaching as well. So sort of a dual kind of staff student role, which was great. And what was very unusual about that was that with the PhD, there was no specific project there to come into. So normally when you go and do a PhD, there's a researcher advertises a particular project that they're working on, and then you come in and work on that particular topic. So you kind of choose the research team and the topic that's being offered. But in my case, it was sort of like you come in and do a PhD, and it's like, day one, what do you want to do? So it was kind of open slather, which is unusual. It does happen, but it's very unusual. So I was lucky in that sense that I could kind of choose whatever topic I wanted to study for my PhD. And one of the things I'd noticed as a practitioner working with a lot of athletes, and a few years before that, Ironman had come to Melbourne for the first time, a full Ironman event in Melbourne for the first time ever. And so there was a period where I was just doing nothing but writing Ironman race nutrition plans for athletes, like from January to March. That's pretty much all I did. And when you write a lot of plans, you have your carbohydrate needs, you have your fluid needs. And then I had this little calculator set up where I could put in the products and the duration of their run leg and their bike leg, and work out all of this stuff. And it had the sodium content of the products in there. And so it was calculating the sodium. And people would say to me, well, how much sodium do I need? Like, it says it's got this much in it. I was like, well, we actually don't really know. There's no guidelines around it. So I couldn't tell them. So this little sodium thing kept popping up in my spreadsheet, but I wasn't using it. I wasn't really referring to it. It was just there. It was just numbers. So when the opportunity came up to do the PhD, I thought, you know what? Let's have a look at that little cell in the spreadsheet that kind of gets ignored and
Yeah.
gets ignored from a research point of view largely as well, because there was a lot of research around, I guess, sweat testing and perfecting the process of working out how much sodium you lose. But there was really no research happening into, okay, once you do that test and you get that value, what do you do with it? And so that was very much where I sort of wanted to explore things and move things forward a bit, is to try and
Yeah.
work out, well, what do you do with that number?
Yeah.
And that
And
sort of kicked off my research career.
about what year is this all kind of happening? Like when are we talking?
Yeah, so my PhD started at the start of 2016. So I was
Okay,
sort
so
of
pretty
thinking about this
recent.
towards the end of 2015. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
So I did the
And so
PhD and finished that off, thankfully, just before COVID, because a lot of the PhD students during COVID had a real struggle, in terms of being locked out of labs and things like that.
yeah.
Thankfully, I was able to finish about 12 months before that all happened. So
Oh,
that was
that's
lucky.
great. That's great.
Mm.
Yeah, all right. So then take us through that process and what you do now, and how you were able to use that research to, incorporate that into the work that you do and how you help endurance athletes now.
Yeah. So I still work as a practitioner. Like, that never stopped throughout that whole
Mm.
time, and I still consult to athletes. We've got Ultra Trail Australia coming up here in a couple of months' time, so busy with quite a few athletes preparing for that event, and other various events, not just in ultra running but in other sports as well. I've done some work with Triathlon Australia for the Tokyo Olympics and Paralympics, and still working with a couple of their athletes in preparation for hopefully Paris if they qualify. So yeah, there's that sort of side of things going on. I'm still working at the university, both in a teaching role but a research role as well. And so some of that sodium research has carried on since the PhD, and that's
Mhm.
probably some of the more interesting research which we can really start to take things away from and use. So we were able to get some grant funding from the Ultra Sport Science Foundation to move some of that research forward and do things that really haven't been done before, in terms of sodium. So yeah,
Amazing.
it's for me, it's both the research and the practitioner role. So
Mhm.
I do both of those. I work for a company called Fuelin, which is a triathlon, well, mostly triathlon. It's for other endurance sports as well, an app that kind of syncs with your training program to build nutrition recommendations. So working with them, both with their individual athletes, but also on the back end of the algorithms that kind of underlie that. And then do some other bits and pieces, some education work with Sports Dietitians Australia here, and then continuing with the research. So yeah, lots of
Yeah.
different bits and pieces, and then my own podcast, Fueling Endurance. So it's busy,
Okay.
but it's fun.
Yep. We love to keep busy, don't we? We love to have so
Yes.
many balls in the air, so many things on the go.
Yeah.
Just for my own knowledge, just to kind of backtrack a little bit. So you have accredited practicing dietitians, and then you have accredited sport dietitians. Is the university education component different for those two tracks, or do you start out the same and then specialize, say, during an internship or something? Like, what's the process for those two being different?
Sure. So you have to be an accredited practicing dietitian first. So that's your
Okay,
university qualification. And then
got
you
it.
go on and do further education to become an accredited sports dietitian. So the
Okay,
pathway for that has changed a little bit over the years, but now that's a course that's actually run by Sports Dietitians Australia. You have to go and do that
okay,
course to become accredited as a sports dietitian in Australia. And I'm lucky enough to be the one who runs that course. So
okay. Right on.
yeah, I get to meet all the new incoming sports dietitians, which is great because then you go on and see what they get to do out in the world once they sort of do the course and see all the awesome things they do, which is fun as well.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's amazing. So, today we're here to talk about hydration for runners. And, like you, I see myself working more and more and more these days with, ultra endurance athletes. Especially where I live, there's a growing and really sort of blossoming ultra running community. We have lots of open, wide spaces here in Manitoba. So, we got lots of room to go and run really, really far. Um, so let's kind of start with an overview of hydration for runners and why it matters, and specifically what happens to performance when someone becomes dehydrated. How do we kind of define that?
Hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Obviously, there's been a lot of research in hydration over several decades now. And despite that, there's still a huge amount of unanswered questions in this space, I think. And so, we can say, it does this and it does that and it does that. but sometimes we don't necessarily understand or can explain fully the underlying biology behind some of this stuff. So I guess the probably the big headlines that we do kind of understand and we're pretty confident about is as you lose water from the body during exercise, obviously the total amount of water in your body, we call that the total body water, will go down. And that includes both the water inside our cells and on the outside of our cells. So that's the fluid surrounding our cells, and also the fluid in our blood volume. So those things kind of all decrease. Now, there's a bit of shift of fluid between those, and we might get into that later if it's relevant. But yeah, all of those things kind of reduce. As a result of that, we have a few things that happen while we're running. Firstly, we notice that our body temperature will be a little bit higher than it would have been otherwise. It's usually not a massive difference, though. We're not talking like 1 or 2 degrees. We're talking about, 0.2 to 0.4 degrees or something like that. If you're severely dehydrated, maybe a little bit more than that, but it's not a massive difference in body temperature. And it's still, I guess, debatable whether that difference in temperature explains, for example, the performance effects that you see from dehydration as well. Mm-hmm. The other thing I guess most people may be familiar with is what we call cardiac drift. It's the fact that our heart rate tends to be higher for the same amount of work rate or output when you're more dehydrated. And again, this is an area where there's kind of the simple explanation, but it's probably not the full explanation. So people talk about, well, of course, you've got lower blood volume, so the heart has to beat faster to basically circulate the same, get the same amount of blood circulation because there's less blood to pump around the body. And that's kind of the simple explanation, but it's probably not a full one. Mm-hmm. And we know, for example, that there are changes in terms of the body's stress response to exercise, how the stress hormones in the nervous system kind of interact with all of this stuff, and that affects heart rate in and of itself. And that is affected by hydration as well. And on that, in terms of that stress response, that will affect not only heart rate, but it affects things like gut function. And we know that dehydration is not the only risk factor, probably not even the main risk factor, but it is a risk factor for gut issues during exercise as well, if you're significantly dehydrated. Absolutely. The other one, I guess, is the obvious one, is thirst. As you become more dehydrated, you become more thirsty. And that's simply because the concentration of all the, what we call the solutes, the minerals and proteins and things in the blood relative to the amount of water in the blood, the amount of water is going down faster than the amount of salts and things, even though we're losing some of that in sweat as well. We're losing less of that, relatively speaking, to water. So our blood is becoming more concentrated, and that signals to the brain to make us thirsty. It also signals to the kidneys to retain fluid, so you tend to pee out less, although maybe not necessarily that much of an issue during exercise, because we tend to not pee out much during exercise anyway, because the water's going out through our sweat glands. And until you have extreme dehydration, the amount of water you lose through the sweat glands doesn't really change because we're dehydrated. Because if you think about it, that water is serving a purpose of trying to keep us cool, regulate our body temperature. We don't really want to compromise that if we don't absolutely have to.
Yeah. All right. So when it comes to hydration, the main thing that you kind of mentioned here was the fluid, right? Like were the total body water and sweat losses and, the impacts that we see on urination and that sort of thing. But we've got, of course, the hydration side of the coin and then the sodium or the electrolyte side of the coin. So what role does that play in hydration, sort of in the context of performance nutrition and running?
Yeah, so I guess, as you said, people will use either the term electrolytes or they might talk about sodium. And I guess, electrolytes is probably more of a collective term that talks about a whole bunch of different minerals. So sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chloride. There's probably more that we could mention in that bucket as well. I guess the reason that we tend to focus on sodium is, of all of those, it's by far the one that's lost in the greatest quantities. So the amount of magnesium, calcium we lose in sweat is very, very, very small. The amount of chloride is kind of matched to the sodium, and so we tend to use sodium as a proxy for both. And the amount of potassium lost is also smaller, not insignificant, but smaller, and also relatively constant. So the body regulates the amount of sodium and chloride that's lost, but it doesn't seem to regulate or alter the amount of the magnesium, calcium, potassium that are lost. They're kind of relatively
very
constant.
Interesting. Very interesting.
In terms of the concentration, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's why the focus is primarily on sodium. So in terms of the role that sodium has in body fluid and kind of regulating all of that, so we've got most of the sodium in our body is floating around in our fluids. Some of it is stored in parts of the body, in the skin, for example, or muscle, other places, a little bit in bone. And that is an area that's less well understood. I think we're still learning about that. Firstly, mostly in the kind of clinical situations, things like heart failure and kidney failure and things like that. But I think, hopefully over time we'll learn a bit more about the role that may or may not have in ultra endurance athletes. We just don't know at this stage.
Yeah.
But in terms of its role within fluid, it's floating around in our fluids. As I said before, we've got fluids on the inside of our cells and on the outside of our cells, and there is a big difference between the amount of sodium in those two places. So there's very little sodium inside our cells. There's a lot of potassium, but not much sodium. And the reverse is true on the outside of our cells. So we have a lot of sodium there. So this means that sodium is the dominant mineral on the outside of the cells, and so it has the biggest influence on moving fluid between the inside and the outside of the cells, between the potassium on the inside and the sodium on the outside. So if we were, for example, just sitting here, we opened up a packet of pretzels or something really salty, and we started to eat that, we're putting more sodium into the body without putting water in. That's going to make our blood and that fluid outside the cells more salty, and that's going to draw some of the water out of our cells into the water that surrounds. So our blood volume will increase slightly. The other things that happen is signaling thirst. I mentioned before, as our blood becomes saltier, we get thirstier, and we tend to conserve fluid so we don't pee out as much. Although, as I said, during exercise, that's less of an issue. So they're probably the key roles that sodium has, from a biological standpoint, is that thirst mechanism. So it's driving that behavior to try and get more fluid into the body. It's trying to conserve water so we don't lose as much. Or the reverse, obviously, if the reverse is true, we drink a lot of water and not much sodium and we dilute everything, the opposite will obviously happen. And then the other is the movement of water between the inside and the outside of the cells and the balance between those two.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. So when it comes to hydration, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you consistently see runners making with their hydration practices?
Yeah. There's a couple of big ones, and I think these are particularly relevant for ultra distance events because obviously the longer the duration becomes, the more these mistakes potentially kind of amplify things. So the first one would be going into long training sessions or a race with really no idea of what your expected fluid needs will be or your expected fluid losses will be.
Yeah.
So if you're going in and you're like, don't know what my sweat rate is, don't know how much fluid I need, there's a big chance that you could either really underdo it or overdo it and end up in the medical tent with hyponatremia or something like that because you've just drank too much.
Yeah.
The other issue there is actually running out of fluid between checkpoints in an ultra. So if you don't know how much fluid you're going to need from checkpoint 2 to checkpoint 3, and it's a long distance, it's a hot day, and you run out of fluid, there's no worse feeling than being super thirsty and having no fluid there to drink in a race. It's just an awful feeling. I've been there in mountain biking myself. I'm sure we've all been there at some stage. Yeah, so that's probably the first one is not having no idea of how much fluid you actually need.
Okay.
The second one would be having no plan or strategy around that. So even if you do know what your fluids needs roughly are, having no sort of plan in terms of, okay, between this checkpoint and this checkpoint, I need to carry this much with me. When I see my crew at this next checkpoint, I need to get this much fluid from them to go on. So, we talk about kind of drinking to thirst versus drinking to a plan. And over the years, there have been some pretty, I guess, vocal scientists that have been very dichotomous on this and really trying to set up this like good versus evil, like it's one or the other kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I don't see it as that at all. I see it as, they're two extremes on the spectrum. But most of us are probably sitting somewhere in the middle where thirst is giving us feedback and helping us make decisions. But it's not the be all and end all, because if your entire plan is just drink to thirst with no thought about how much water do I need to carry between checkpoints and that kind of thing, again, you can drink to thirst, but if you're thirsty and there's no water there, you can't drink to thirst. So that's not helpful either.
Yeah.
So having a plan of how much water is available is still going to be important.
Yeah.
The opposite of that is, people going out and doing sweat rate testing and saying my sweat rate is whatever it is, like a certain number. And one, thinking that that's a fixed number, that it's always the same. It's not always the same. It's going to change for a whole bunch of different reasons. It's going to change because the weather changes. And in an ultra, obviously, that's going to be across the course of one race. You start first thing in the morning when it's cold. It might get really hot in the middle of the day, and then you're going overnight where it's cold again. And so even if you're running at exactly the same pace that entire time, you would expect that your sweat rate is going to change as the weather changes over that period of time. So it's not a fixed number.
Even something like a marathon, right? I mean, you start running a marathon at 6 or 7 in the morning. And if, you're going to be taking maybe 4 or 5 hours to finish that race, you might be finishing up. It's going to be close to noon by then. Like there can be a dramatic change in temperature from the beginning to the end of even something like a marathon.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the other thing with particularly trail running is the terrain. That's going to change your work output. So even if your pace isn't necessarily different, the amount of work you're doing uphill versus downhill and things like that is changing dramatically. Wind, if you're behind a mountain and there's no airflow, or you're in an exposed area where, you're getting huge amount of wind, that changes the ability for sweat to evaporate off your body and cool you down. And that's going to change your sweat rate as well. So there's a lot of variables in there. And I kind of describe it as, particularly in ultra distance events, is hydration is kind of trying to hit a moving target while blindfolded. So the moving target is the fact that your sweat rate is constantly changing, and the blindfolded part is, how do you know if you're over drinking, under drinking at any point in time? It's really hard to kind of figure that out. Thirst will give you some feedback around that, but it's not perfect at all times and in everyone. So it does help, and I think we have to listen to that at some stage, but it's not going to be a magic bullet. It is just go into a race with no plan and go just drink to thirst, or go into a race with a rigid plan saying my sweat rate is this and I need to drink 700 mils an hour for the next 20 hours or something like that. That's probably going to lead to under drinking at some stages, over drinking at other stages, and possibly disaster somewhere along the way.
Yeah. Okay. So all that kind of being said, we're sort of focusing our conversation today around longer distance running. Definitely half marathon and longer is always sort of where I sort of start to think about like bigger distances and longer races. When you're comparing a half marathon to like some of the ultra races that people do, it seems like a drop in the bucket mileage wise. But still, in terms of, like you were alluding to, the importance of planning, the importance of organization, the risks of maybe not doing those things properly. For me, that's kind of the threshold where it starts to become more important. How would a runner's hydration plan, or how should their hydration plan change to running something like a 5K or a 10K as we move through those distances, getting up to something like an ultra?
Yeah. Look, I think there's probably a couple of different, or probably 3 different factors here that are relevant. The first one is the actual sweat rate itself. So how much fluid are you actually losing? How quickly are you becoming dehydrated versus the duration of the event? Like you might be becoming dehydrated quickly, but then it's over quickly as well for the shorter events. The second one is the access to fluid during the event, and that's obviously going to be very different in a shorter event versus a really long event in terms of, you're physically carrying water on your back in an ultra distance event versus grabbing cups on the run or something in a marathon where you spill half of it all over yourself, and you get some in, but and also you don't want to in those races everywhere. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's just hard to like get in without spilling, but also to swallow it, as you said, without choking when you're running at that speed and your breathing rate is that high as well. And also the other factor there is, the time cost of doing that. In an ultra, you'll stop at checkpoints for a period of time and you refill your flasks and all that kind of thing. Whereas in a marathon, you don't even really want to break stride in terms of accessing fluid, because that might be like the advantage in getting the fluid might be more than offset by the slowing down to get that fluid in the first place. And so there's a trade-off there. And then the third one is kind of the gut tolerance of that fluid also. So even if you can get it in, can you actually tolerate it without having sort of major gut issues and that kind of thing?
Yeah.
So just to expand on that a little bit, I think in terms of sweat rate, your sweat rate is determined by the amount of heat our body is producing during exercise, because we've got to get rid of that heat from the body to stop our core temperature rising too much. And it's obviously dependent on the climatic conditions, so how hot it is, how humid it is as well is important there. And then the clothing that we're wearing, like, is that preventing that sweat evaporating off our skin? So I guess the big one here in terms of, say, 5K to ultra marathon is the pace, the intensity, and that's dictating how much body heat we're producing per minute or per hour of exercise. So the faster the pace, the more calories we're burning per second, per minute, whatever it is. Therefore, the more heat we're producing, because heat is a byproduct of that, and therefore the more heat we're going to get rid of. So you would expect a sweat rate in a 10K or a half marathon is going to be a lot greater than it is in an ultra marathon. But the flip side to that, of course, is it's a shorter period of time. So you don't actually need to replace as much of that because you're less likely to become severely dehydrated. It's not going to compound over 10 or 15 hours of running as it would in an ultra. So it's a bit of a trade-off between all of those things.
Yeah. So in your opinion, for someone running a 5K or a 10K, is hydration something that runner should still be thinking about as part of their plan for the day, or at those distances? And I guess, we also have to talk about pace. How long is it going to take us to complete a 5K or a 10K? Because of course there's, endless, kind of variation there. But is that sort of at the forefront of the conversation? Or is it really more once we start getting into, say, the half marathon and longer, that it's, the organization and planning and kind of knowing what you're going to do with your hydration becomes really key?
Yeah, certainly for the during event stuff, I'd totally agree with that. It's really half marathon and greater. Just the shorter events are short enough that you're not going to develop enough dehydration no matter how hard you're working. Or even if you do, it's going to be so impractical or so much of a disadvantage to slow down to access that amount of fluid. The gut tolerance is going to be so poor if you're an elite runner running a 10K. You're just not going to be able to get in significant amount of fluid anyway, even if you wanted to. So, that's just a practical constraint. So I guess for the shorter distances, the importance is probably actually more about the hydration before you even start the race and being as well hydrated as you can. I mean, obviously you want to do that for an ultra, but it's going to be much more important for those shorter events because you're not going to be able to make up for that during the race. Whereas in an ultra, how hydrated you are at the start, it's probably not going to matter that much 20 hours into a race when you've had 20 hours of either... Yeah, exactly. And it's not going to make that much difference if you've been either over drinking or under drinking for the last 100 kilometers or something like that.
Yeah. No, that's a really great way of thinking about it. So what I've noticed, and I don't know if you've kind of noticed this trend lately, but what I've sort of noticed is that a lot of runners are becoming more aware of the importance of hydration, but more so like the importance of sodium replacement, electrolyte replacement. And along with that, I'm seeing a lot of products coming out, a lot of companies creating products that are much higher in sodium than what we had seen, maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And how would a runner know if maybe they're a good fit or a good candidate for choosing a higher sodium, electrolyte product or a higher sodium intra-run fueling product versus someone who really doesn't need something like that? Because there's such a huge spectrum variation. Like you were saying at the beginning of the episode, when you used to do this testing for people, it was like, you've got this number on the spreadsheet, but there's no way of really telling who needs how much. We don't really have great recommendations. So what's kind of the update on that?
Yeah. And certainly on that product, so I certainly feel that here as well. And it always amazes me how many new products come out. I'm like, is this market not saturated already? Like, how can there be place in the market for another 5 electrolyte products this year on top of the 45 that are already on the market? Like, how do they all stay in business? I got no idea. But anyway, just as an aside, but in terms of like the need for sodium and then determining how much you need, that's something that I've been looking at over the last few years in terms of my research and trying to think sort of logically through. And I think this is the thing that people don't stop and do, is actually ask the question, what, not only do I need sodium, but why do I need sodium? And then based on the answer to that question, the next question would be, well, based on that need, how much is enough, kind of thing. And so, particularly with the rise of sweat testing, which has often been driven by the same companies that then sell the sodium products themselves. Going back in time, there's been a sort of an implication, well, if you lose this much sodium per hour, you should be replacing 100% of that. And we know that's definitely not the case. I think some companies are kind of improving their messaging around that as they realize that that's just scientifically incorrect. But if we run through, I guess, the different reasons that you might want to replace sodium during exercise, then it kind of gives you a bit of an idea about how much. So I guess the first thing that we think about is that before I was saying, you eat the salty food at rest and it makes you more thirsty and then you want to drink more. So the first one is having salt in your food or drinks during exercise because it actually makes you thirstier and drives, more fluid intake if that's necessary thing. Like, there's obviously some situations where maybe someone tends to end up overhydrated. That's probably not a good thing necessarily. But in some scenarios where people don't tend to be inclined to drink enough during exercise, if that gives them that little push to drink better and they improve their hydration as a result, that's probably a good thing.
Yeah.
Now, the amount of sodium that you need to achieve that is probably not something that we can sort of do a test and put a value in a spreadsheet and say, this is how much you need. It's really just about, well, how salty does the drink taste? Does it tend to make you want to drink more? Yes or no? Because if it tastes too salty and you go, oh, I don't like it, you might actually end up drinking less. And that's kind of defeats the purpose. So the amount of salt in that case is not really a scientific question. It's a personal preference question about how salty do you like your food and drinks, and what is that doing to you in terms of encouraging or discouraging fluid intake relative to what you need, essentially. So that's kind of a behavioral element to that. The second one that often gets talked about is fluid absorption. So how well do you absorb the fluid from the gut to help from a hydration point of view? And the research shows that at some parts of the gut, it does help. But if you look over the gut in its totality, where we absorb water from, the difference is small, if any at all. And so, again, probably it's not important from that point of view. And even if it was, it would be about the drink formulation rather than how much salt are you losing during exercise. So you don't need a sweat rate test to tell you that, even if it was true, but it doesn't seem to be overall. The next things are, well, does it help me in terms of regulating my, stopping that cardiac drift, reducing kind of that overall stress of exercise, body temperature, those kind of sort of physiological things. And so the theoretical rationale there might be, well, if it helps me retain more of the water on the outside of the cells, which includes the blood volume rather than the inside of the cells, I can kind of make the most of the water I do have in the body, and that might help me. That's one of the things that we looked at in my research. We actually got people running on the treadmill for 5 hours in 30-degree heat.
Where did you find people that were willing to run on a treadmill? For all the Fahrenheit people listening, 30 degrees is real hot.
Yeah, about 90-ish.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. It was tough. We only got 9 in the end. We hoped to get sort of 16, 8 males, 8 females. But in the end, we gave up with 7 males and 2 females. I mean, that was interrupted by COVID as well, which made it tricky. But yeah, we got to the point where, like, I don't think we're going to get anyone else. So we found a few people. I remember one of them actually had emailed me. He was on the plane back from Marathon des Sables. So he'd been running for 7 days out in the desert. And so he came in and he's like, oh, this feels nice.
Well,
Yeah. But there were others that, the 5 hours was definitely a bit of a struggle. And the reason that we went for 5 hours is we really wanted to stress the body sodium stores, like really achieve a significant sodium deficit to see if we could see any effect of that on the body and on how they kind of performed. And so we gave them capsules so we could blind it so they didn't know whether they were getting the salt or not. And we replaced either 100% or 0% of the sodium that they were losing. So we measured them beforehand and then gave it back to them during the 2 5-hour runs. And we didn't see any difference in how much fluid they drank. I mean, there was a little difference. It wasn't statistically significant for the people who understand research in the audience. The difference was only like 70 mils an hour or something. And there was no difference in heart rate. There was no difference in core temperature. There was no difference in their perceived effort, like how hard they felt they were working. None of those things were different between the two groups. So to me, that suggests that the sodium alone is not going to impact these things unless it changes the amount of water that you're drinking, which in this study it didn't. There are other studies where it has, and you have seen some differences in those things, but we didn't see that in our study.
Yeah. And so they were able to drink as much as they wanted over the course of the 5 hours?
Yeah, so it was one of the things that we deliberately did in this study, because there have been a couple of studies previous to this sort of 3 to 4 hour duration, usually on a bike in the lab rather than running. But they've deliberately replaced 100% of their water losses. So they've replaced the same amount of water in both trials with or without the sodium. We wanted to do the opposite. We wanted to look at what effect the sodium was going to have on their thirst and what it was going to do to how much fluid they would voluntarily drink. And the answer was, in this case, not much.
Okay.
But there might be some situations or some athletes where it does, and then there might be a theoretical benefit to doing that. But if it doesn't change your fluid intake, it's not going to change much physiologically for you. Performance, we didn't measure performance in this study. I wanted to do a little performance test at the end of the 5 hours, but was told that I was being cruel enough to them already and to not put them through that after the 5 hours. So that didn't happen, unfortunately.
That's
but probably fair. Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah. I mean, unless you're going to be one of the participants, you do the 5 hours,
true.
and then we'll talk, right?
Yeah, exactly right. So we actually, as part of my PhD, did a systematic review. So we went out and tried to find all the studies that have ever been done on sodium replacement and performance in endurance exercise, and we could only find, I think it was 5 or 6 off the top of my head. It's been a few years since I looked at it, but only one of them actually showed a beneficial effect of performance. It was in a half Ironman race where they just gave one group of people salt capsules and the other group placebo capsules. The difference was probably explained by the fluid intake. So there was a difference in fluid intake in that study. But also when you're doing it in a real life triathlon where it's not crossed over so the people aren't their own controls, there's a lot of noise in that kind of research. And the difference in the performance was so big that I'm a little bit skeptical. Like, you don't see performance differences like that from carbohydrate, from fluid, from caffeine. Like, it was like 8% difference in performance. So I'm just like, I think there's a level of random effect going on here, and the fact that you haven't seen it in any other study. That said, the studies that have been done aren't fantastic. None of them have been done in hot weather. A lot of them have been done in field conditions that haven't been very well controlled. So, someone has a poor transition in a triathlon, and that's going to influence your result, things like that. And so I think there's a need to do more research in that area. But at this stage, we don't have good evidence that sodium replacement per se will help performance, probably unless it drives better hydration practices.
Yeah. So at the same time, though, on kind of that same note, there isn't necessarily a downside or a reduction in performance by including sodium. So, like, if a runner found a product that they really liked, it tasted good, they were, it allowed them to drink the amount that they needed to maintain adequate hydration during their workouts or during a race, and it happened to be a higher sodium product, even if they don't need the sodium, it wouldn't be wrong or bad for them to use that product, as long as it wasn't contributing to overhydration.
Yeah, that's right. And so that has been one concern that has been made in the ultra endurance space, is would excess salt intake mainly from like capsules or tablets or something actually then ironically drive fluid intake that was so high that would cause overhydration related issues. There has been a couple of case studies in the literature about that, but really we didn't see any evidence of that in our study in sort of lab controlled conditions. The studies are kind of retrospective case studies of, someone landed in hospital and you kind of work back to see what had happened. So I'm a little bit iffy on how well the actual sodium intake and fluid intake have been described in those. So it may be there. We certainly didn't see it. Can you have too much sodium? Yeah, you probably can, because you can actually drive your blood sodium too high to the point where you get nausea or vomiting in extreme cases, but just really significant thirst if you've not got enough fluid to kind of satisfy that thirst. Or as you said, if you do you end up then drinking too much? So there can be a rationale around that. And I guess the final thing I forgot to say there with the 5 hours, 5 hours in the context of an ultra is actually not that long. You can have 20 or 30 hour events. And so I did a modeling study as well and looked at the effect of both water and sodium replacement on blood sodium concentration. So the risk of sort of hyponatremia, if the blood sodium goes too low, it's been diluted by the water, or the opposite, hypernatremia, where the blood's becoming really salty, usually because of dehydration, but excess salt, theoretically, if you don't replace the fluid, could do that as well. What we found in that is that there is a theoretical rationale for deliberate and sort of planned sodium replacement in ultra distance events. Basically, once you have a need to replace more than about 70% of your fluid losses during exercise, then there's a rationale for taking sodium to help retain that fluid in the blood. As I said before, there is those sodium stores in the body that some people have sort of speculated might get released to help compensate for the lack of that, but we just don't know that at this stage. It's kind of speculation. So yeah, I think that's where probably for the ultra distance events, there's a theoretical rationale for it. For the shorter events, no. I'd say anything less than 4 hours, yeah, you could have it if you prefer it from a taste point of view, but there's no need to go out and get a sweat test and go, I need this amount of sodium specifically.
Yeah, yeah. And so what I found really interesting, just like, working with athletes and kind of listening to them and making modifications and trying different things and, seeing how it works for them, with this messaging that you've got here and the webinar that I had listened to of two of yours that I thought was so fascinating, the key takeaway here is that the research doesn't really support aggressive sodium replacement as like this big key factor in performance. But what I find is that a lot of people do tend to feel better and tend to, notice their own performance improves or feel as though their performance improves when they do start to incorporate electrolytes into part of their hydration plan. So if the research isn't really supporting that, what are your thoughts, or do you have any thoughts around what might be going on there, that like the individual experience or perception is quite different than what we're seeing kind of unfolding in the research on this area?
Yeah, there's probably a few different theories that you can kind of level at this. Kind of the easy, almost, I'm going to say cop out, but almost is to say, oh, it's just a placebo effect.
Mm-hmm.
They believe they feel better because they're taking this and people have told them it'll help. Maybe there is a placebo effect. I don't know. I don't think it's ever been sort of tested specifically. But I think there are a couple of other reasons potentially as well. One is what we just talked about in terms of encouraging better hydration practices.
Mm-hmm.
So if having saltier fluids encourages you to drink more, then you improve your hydration, your fluid replacement, and that actually helps. And you feel better because you're actually getting more fluid in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is that sometimes that fluid comes along with carbohydrate. So it encourages more carbohydrate intake. Actually, maybe you're fueling better as well. So they could be two reasons that it might happen. Certainly in ultra distance events, like the shift of fluid between the inside and the outside of the cells may start to become relevant at those sort of really long distances. I think at the short distances, probably less so, but whether it's making a difference there, hard to say. The data suggests probably not. I suspect it's more about, you're fueling and hydrating better overall because the sodiums help drive better fluid and fueling practices.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, in some regard, in some instances, if it is something like a placebo effect, I mean, if someone performs better because they believe that they can, like, what it reminds me of is the original Space Jam movie when he gives them all the what I can't remember what he puts on the label, Bugs Bunny on the label, and he gives everyone that juice and they get all jacked up and everything, and it turns out it was just water.
Yes, and people that aren't as old as us maybe think about one of the Harry Potter movies. I can't remember which one it is, where he gives Ron the thing that's meant to be the good luck potion, but it's not.
Yes.
It's
yeah. You're right.
Same
you're right.
thing.
Okay. Yeah. Exactly. Love
so
it.
The final thing I was just remembering there is, So the other factor that may play into this as well is a psychological effect that's a little bit different to a placebo effect, and that's around the taste aspect to this. So if you're having salty things in your mouth, in terms of, again, more the ultra events probably than the shorter distance ones, but flavor fatigue can be really big in those events, and you get sick of those sweet sticky things all of a sudden, for hours and hours on end. And I say to people, like, you get to 6 hours into a race and you pull a gel out of your pocket and you look at it and you just want to cry because you just don't want another one of those again. And so sometimes I think having something really salty gives you a psychological boost just from the flavor or the relief from that sweet sticky stuff all the time. That can be, I think, very underestimated as a potential psychological boost, whether it translates directly into performance or whether it just makes you feel better. You don't necessarily perform better. It's probably different in different people, but I suspect there's something in that as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, earlier in the episode and a couple of times we've sort of touched really briefly on this idea of like sweat testing. And there's, a few different ways that we can sort of go about doing this, but I kind of just wanted to get your thoughts on the different types of sweat testing that can be done. I mean, we've got your basic, pre-exercise, post-exercise weight as something that people can just easily do at home and keep track of, all the way to like, lab type testing, the sensors that we can wear now. So I just kind of wanted to get an overview of like the different tests that are out there, pros and cons, like is there a method that you recommend, and just, let's talk about testing our sweat.
Yeah. So there's two aspects to this. One is understanding the actual fluid losses, and one is understanding the sodium losses. And they're two different types of testing, often done together, but they are two quite distinct types of testing. So we start off with the actual fluid loss, the sweat rate testing. Yeah, the traditional method would be to weigh yourself before and after, look at the change in weight, and for any exercise of less than about 3 hours, that's a pretty good proxy for, weight loss is a pretty good proxy for fluid loss. Obviously, you need to correct for any solid food that you've eaten. Any urine losses, if you're looking specifically at sweat rate, you have to account for that. So yeah, there's a few little things you've got to kind of correct for depending on what's happening in that session. But yeah, generally speaking, that weight loss will be a reasonable correlation. And then you're saying basically one kilogram is 1 liter of fluid, essentially, or that's the assumption that you make. When you're doing that kind of a testing, a couple of things I generally suggest to athletes when you do that kind of test that I think really adds value to that testing process. So rather than just doing that and saying my sweat rate was this, the other things I think is really valuable to add to that test is firstly to measure, or you probably need to anyway to measure how much fluid you actually drank during the session. Whether that's quantifying it by lines on your bottle, or actually weighing your bottles or flasks before and afterwards. That can be helpful. The other things that I would generally do is capture a rating of thirst from 0 to 10 before and after the session. And then the final thing I would do is capture some measurement, again, probably on a 0 to 10 scale, of gut tolerance to fluid. So 0 might be absolutely no gut issues at all, and 10 is absolutely horrendous kind of gut issues.
Okay.
And the reason that I like to capture those is it's one thing to know your sweat rate and then know how much you drank. And maybe at the end of that, you say, I drank about the right amount, or I drank too much or not enough. But if you're not drinking enough, what it doesn't tell you without that other details is why aren't you drinking enough. So when you have estimates of thirst, you've got gut tolerance assessment there as well. You start to get a picture of why are you not drinking enough during exercise. So therefore, what are you going to do about it? So you get to the end of that. If you decide I'm not drinking enough during the session, you look at the thirst. What did my thirst say? Was I really thirsty? No. Okay, well, I wasn't drinking much because my thirst wasn't telling me to drink much. So now I'm thinking, maybe thirst for me is not a great indication of my fluid needs. I need to kind of recalibrate that relationship a little bit and think about how I kind of perceive thirst and how I interpret that signal, essentially, for drinking. But the opposite might be true. It might be, actually, I was really thirsty, but I had all these gut issues and I just couldn't drink. Like, I've got a gut tolerance issue to fluid. And that's a very different kind of strategy. You got to go away and do some gut training to try and improve your gut tolerance of fluid in that scenario. So completely different solution to the same sort of initial bit of data. And then the third one might be, well, I drank all my fluid and then I had nothing left. And so I ended up dehydrated because I just didn't bring enough fluid. So it was just a planning and organization issue. So adding that extra information gives you so much more context to that sweat rate testing that really tells you why and what to do about it. So that's the sweat rate testing. Some of the wearables will give you an estimate of sweat rate and things like that. Most of them, from what I've seen, are yet to be sort of independently validated. So actually directly sort of head-to-head compared in sort of valid testing conditions against measures of sweat rate with weight change to show whether they're accurate or not. Now, I'm sure a lot of these companies have probably done that internally, but it's not in the public domain, so we don't know how accurate they are or not. There has been a little bit of work. I know Gatorade have got their smart sweat patch, and they've done some work around that. And I know that they've found that estimating sweat rate from a single site on the body is very, very difficult to do accurately. So I would be fairly skeptical about the wearable devices telling you what your sweat rate is until information comes along to prove otherwise, essentially. And that might come, that might be published next week. It might be published next year. it might turn out that they're absolutely rubbish and we never get, justification for that. Don't know. And I'm happy to change my mind if the research gets published, but at this stage it hasn't been. So that's the sweat rate testing side of things.
Mm-hmm.
The other side of the equation is to look at the sodium loss side of things. And there's a few different testing methods that are used in this space, and they vary from very accurate but very impractical to very practical but maybe not so accurate. So I guess the gold standard measure of sodium loss in sweat during exercise is what's called a whole body washdown. And this is where you basically exercise in what's almost like a giant plastic bag, so none of the sweat can escape. And most of the sweat will drip off onto the floor. And when you usually do this on a stationary bike, where it's not an electric one, because you're about to pour a whole bunch of fluid on it and you don't want to blow up your electronics. And then at the end of the exercise, you get out. They drown you in about 5 liters of some sort of fluid, usually like deionized water or some other kind of chemical. Drown the bike in that as well. You take all your clothes off, leave them in the bottom of the plastic bag, and you get out nude, go get changed. And then they kind of take this giant bag, which has this soup of sweat and fluid and dirty clothes and stuff at the bottom of it, swirl it around to mix it all together, and then take a sample of that out. And that's a sample of sweat. And then you can account based on how much fluid you douse the person in to work out what's sweat and what's fluid. So that captures all the sweat from the entire body. And that's important because the amount of sodium you lose is different at different sites of the body. So really, ultimately we'd like to capture what's happening across the whole body, but very impractical. You can't do it on a treadmill because you destroy your treadmill. You can't do it outdoors because you can't, run continuously in a plastic bag. So, and you can't get the proper airflow and humidity and stuff that reflects the real world. So it's used from a methodological point of view in research, but it's not really practical in the real world. So you generally don't see this done outside of about 3 or 4 research labs around the world. The next method that you might use is to, and this is probably the one that's most commonly used, is to stick on disposable patches onto the skin, and then they have an absorbent part, and that absorbs some of the sweat from the underlying area of skin. And then you take that off. You can extract the sweat in a couple of different ways, and then you've got a little sample of that person's sweat from that part of the body, and then you can measure the sodium content of that sweat, so that how many milligrams or millimoles of sodium per liter of that sweat. That's probably been the method that's been used the most over the last probably 2 or 3 decades, and continues to be used in research and commercial sweat testing setups. Some of them will use this technique. This one does a reasonable job of not interrupting the function of the sweat glands too much, so it's not sort of artificially changing the composition of the sweat. You do need to correct the values that you get, though, because the sweat sodium on your arm doesn't necessarily reflect what's happening across the whole body. But there are equations from research that's compared the two that you can use to kind of adjust that and estimate what's going on across the whole body from those individual values. So that's probably the method that I would lean towards the most at the moment, based on the research that we have. The other method that is quite widely used these days in commercial settings is a resting sweat test using a method called pilocarpine iontophoresis. And this is basically a technique that was developed several decades ago now for diagnosing cystic fibrosis in toddlers. It uses a chemical that's uses an electric current to basically get it into the skin. That chemical stimulates the sweat glands to produce sweat, and then you can collect that sweat. Now, the benefit of that is you don't even have to be exercising to collect the sweat. You just sit in a room at a table, stick this thing on, and you can produce sweat. And once you've got your sweat sample again, you can just measure how much sodium is in it. The cons to this method is that currently we don't have a head-to-head comparison between this and, say, the patch method during exercise to know how accurately sweat collected at rest reflects sweat collected during exercise. Now, the people that, I guess, promote this kind of technique and have it commercially available will tell you, of course, it's fine. But everyone else is like, well, where's the evidence of this?
But is it?
So, yeah. I'm sure that research will be done at some stage, and it may turn out that it is very representative of exercise. But until we have that research, we simply don't know. And so we have to make sort of assumptions, and there's always that bit of doubt in the back of your mind. Is this actually a valid test?
Yeah.
So generally, at this stage, I wouldn't use that testing. But if research comes out to show it's fine in the future, I'd be more than happy to use it. But I just don't at the moment because I don't know what it's telling me.
Yeah.
And then the final one is coming back to the wearables again. So most of those will give you not only the sweat rate, but the sodium concentration of that sweat as well. And again, they may be accurate, they may not be accurate, but there's just very little validation in most of them. So we just simply don't know yet. And again, I think within the next 5 years, we will know pretty well how accurate these are. But at this stage, we've got no idea because nothing's been published on it.
Yeah. And so, and you may not know the answer to this, but, you mentioned there being a formula or a calculation that someone can do, taking the data from a wearable and to get that whole body sodium equivalent. If you have a wearable that comes with an app that's then giving you information about your sodium sweat loss rate, have they factored that in to the number that they're giving you? Like, have they put that through a calculation to give you an estimate of whole body sodium, or are they just telling you this is what's in the sample that was taken from your sweat? And then you would take that number and you would go do the calculation yourself.
Well, you'd like to hope that they've put that equation in there, but who knows whether they actually have or not.
Okay.
No, we don't know.
Okay.
You'd have to go to each company probably individually and ask them.
Yeah.
The other thing is that those equations were originally developed from research comparing the patches rather than wearables. And so the patches, there's kind of standard sites on the body where they tend to be put.
Yeah.
And so the comparisons are for those sites. The wearables are often in places that are different to that. So it might be like your bicep or like a watch, sort of wrist mounted type one. And we don't have those direct comparisons, at least not yet that I'm aware of.
Okay.
So even if we do have the equations, they're probably not necessarily relevant to the same sites that the wearable devices are being used at the moment.
Yeah.
Now, some of those wearables you can put wherever you want. And so you could theoretically put it in one of those sites that we do have data for and do that. But again, how valid that is, we don't know yet.
Yeah.
I think we will in a few years, but not yet.
Yeah. Oh, very interesting. Very interesting. So just to kind of recap on that, because we sort of covered a lot of different things. So, you shared some tips for, doing a weight before and after to assess fluid losses during exercise. That is definitely something that you would recommend endurance athletes do to understand their fluid losses in different environments, and looking at thirst and gut tolerance as some additional factors to figure out, how can we make sure that we're optimizing hydration. And then in terms of like the sodium content, there's a little bit of a question mark there still with actually figuring out our sodium losses and then thus our need for sodium replacement. But hopefully within the next couple of years, the research will get us a little bit closer to understanding, what can we buy and what can we use to make this a little bit easier.
Yeah. I think with the sweat sodium loss, the question is, do I even need to go and do this testing in the first place? And probably the simplest answer I can give to that is if you're expecting to lose more than about 5 liters of fluid throughout the course of your event, then yes, there may be some use in that.
Yep.
If you're doing an event where you're not likely to lose more than 5 liters, or the event is less than 4 hours, because if you're losing more than 5 liters in 4 hours, you're probably not going to be able to drink enough to replace that regardless. It's just not going to be practical. So the event is less than 4 hours, don't bother. If you're going to lose less than 5 liters of sweat during an event, probably, again, I wouldn't bother.
Yeah.
It's only for that really longer stuff, with you having those significant and prolonged sweat losses, where understanding those sodium needs may be helpful.
Yeah. And I mean, in the endurance athletes world, talk about ultras and triathlons and stuff like that. I mean, it is definitely, there's a lot of events, a lot of people who are going to be over that threshold. But for a lot of marathon runners, definitely your half marathon runners and stuff like that, maybe not so much. Definitely focusing more on the fluid is going to be the key takeaway from our conversation today.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And just on that, in terms of the sweat rate testing, I think you mentioned it before, but I think it's absolutely critical here. I mentioned at the start, one of the mistakes that runners make is thinking that a one-off sweat test gives you a number and that's your number.
Yeah.
it's not. You need to build a profile of sweat rates across different conditions, and particularly if you are someone who's going to be running across different conditions, an ultra, say overnight and then during the day, is understanding what the sweat rates are at those different times of the day, because your fluid requirements and also your sodium requirements are going to change across the course of the day as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that was so much fantastic information. I hope that everyone found it as interesting and insightful as I did when I was listening to your webinar a couple weeks ago. And that's, like I said, what prompted me to reach out to you to have this conversation. Before we sign off for today, do you have any final thoughts or final tips that you want to share with our listeners?
No, I think we've covered pretty much everything.
All right.
Yeah.
So that's wonderful.
Just go out and do lots of testing, and with the sodium stuff, don't worry if you're not going to lose that amount of sweat that we just talked about. But sweat rate testing, I'd encourage that across the board and build that profile. It's not just one number that's a fixed target.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. So where can people find you, connect with you? I know you also have a podcast, so please tell us again where people can tune in and listen to that.
Yeah, so a couple of different things. I guess on the research side of things, I work at Monash University here in Melbourne. So if you Google my name and Monash University, you'll find me pretty quickly there. I think universities love to publish all your details, your email address, and everything online for everyone to see.
I find people all the time that way.
Yep. It's very easy to do. I find very few universities don't do that. So that's very easy to find. If you want access to sort of research and things, because obviously some of it's paywalled, you can go through, say, ResearchGate, for example, and contact me that way, or just email me. That's fine as well. In terms of the individual practice, as I said, I work with a company called Fuelin, but also through my own private practice. But again, Google will find that pretty quickly. And in terms of the podcast, it's called Fueling Endurance, and the podcast really poses a particular question, like common questions that runners, cyclists, and triathletes ask each episode, and then we get usually two parts: an expert, so a researcher or a practitioner, to answer in the part A, and then usually an athlete or a coach to put their sort of practical perspective on the same question in part B as well. And we've just launched last week actually a 6-part podcast series, which is actually following an athlete as they prepare for, in this case, Ultra Trail Australia. So the sort of last 12 weeks of preparation at all the different nutrition things that we work on.
Cool.
And really giving an insight into, I guess, how we work with athletes as dietitians and the different things that they can kind of focus on throughout that last 12 weeks.
Amazing. Well, that sounds very interesting. I will definitely be checking that out. And I hope that lots of our listeners here on the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast check it out as well. I want to thank you so much for taking time out of what sounds like a very, very busy schedule to sit down and spend some time chatting with me and, educating us all a little bit further about all things hydration for runners. I hope that you all listening enjoyed this week's episode and found it helpful as you work on your fueling plan and your hydration plan, getting ready for your upcoming races. And we will see you in next week's episode. Bye for now. The information on this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not to be used or relied upon for the diagnosis or treatment of any health condition. This information does not create a client-practitioner relationship and should not be used as a substitute for professional medical advice.